While the election may still be a week away here in Massachusetts, in Arizona, voters are heading to the polls today. And in one race in particular, the president's influence on the GOP looms large.
Are we going to elect another senator cut from the same cloth as Jeff Flake and John McCain? No!
Last year, Flake, an anti-Trump moderate Republican, announced he would not seek re-election. Now all three Republicans running for his seat have closely aligned themselves with the president and his immigration policies, including, of course, former Sheriff Joe Arpaio, who the president pardoned last year for a contempt charge for racially profiling Latinos. According to a recent poll from the NAACP, it's issues surrounding race that could decide some of the closest contests this midterm election. The group talked to voters from 61 of the most competitive House races, including 31 where people of color make up between 20 and 78% of eligible voters. They found that 77% of black people believe Trump has set race relations back, and 75% of Latinos, 75% of Asians, 64% of Native Americans, and 51% of white voters feel the same way. But will they turn out at the midterm polls in large enough numbers to make a difference? And is either party fielding the right candidates to sway the groups who care about these issues? Joining me are Tanisha Sullivan, president of the NAACP's Boston branch, and Rahsaan Hall, director of the Racial Justice Program at the ACLU of Massachusetts. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you for having us.
So this poll, Tanisha, shows me that people of color are very down on the president and what he's doing to race relations in the U.S. Is that enough to get people to go to the polls and vote, or do people need to be turning out for something as well as against something?
I do believe it's important for people to have something to go to the polls for, but we cannot underestimate that the people will go to the polls to speak out against what they believe are racist policies that are being implemented by this administration in particular. You know, whether we're looking at issues relative to immigration or education, civil rights is still a priority for black and brown people in this country.
I want to ask the same question I asked of Tanisha to you in a slightly different way. I think it's the same question. In 2016, we saw the first drop in African-American turnout in 2 decades. It went from 67% down to 60%. What has happened, Rahsaan Hall, in the past 2 years with President Trump in office that is going to be enough to maybe reverse that trend?
I think the current occupant of the White House has given license to some of the deep-seated racist ideologies and tendencies that exist in this country. It's nothing new, but it just has a new platform, and more people are paying attention to it. And so I think that is what's going to drive and motivate some people to get out and go to the polls. But I think the point of having something for people to vote for, in favor of, because in reality, politics is local. And so the day-to-day conditions of many black folks, many brown folks across the country has not necessarily changed. Certainly, you look at what's happening on the border and the Trump deportation machine and the separation of families, and you look at some of the threats that are coming down the line. But the day-to-day experience of people of color in this country, particularly poor people of color, hasn't changed dramatically.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think what we're going to see, hopefully, with this midterm election is people saying, look, we understand what's happening in D.C. with this particular administration, but being anti-Trump or anti this administration is simply not enough. People are looking for vision in those who are seeking office. People are looking for something, and quite frankly, something new and fresh that speaks to the hope of America and the promise of America. And so I do think that we are going to, yes, there will be those who come out to say, you know what, I'm against what I'm hearing and seeing. But most importantly, people want something hopeful, and they want to hear vision.
So as you two size up the national electoral landscape, are there any candidates of color running in this cycle who you think are doing a good job of doing exactly what you just said? Anyone who stands out as speaking to people's aspirations and hopes, as well as maybe just knocking the president and his policies? You
know, I think a couple of things. Yes, I think that there are people across this country who are running for particular offices, whether we're up and down the ballot, who are exciting, who are energizing.
Give me a couple names.
I'm not going to give you a couple of names, but what I'll say is, but what I'll say is this. You know, whether we're talking about black folks or Latino folks or white people who are running for office. Again, it's the focus on the vision. It's connecting with the voters, not just speaking against Trump, but really talking about the issues that matter most to the people. Look, we've got significant racial wealth gaps in this country. We have significant academic disparities when it comes to our public education system. People want to know that whoever they're sending, whether it's to the State House or to Congress, they want to know that people are going there with a mission to change the status quo.
So since you took the conversation in that direction, I got to say what you just described sounds an awful lot to me like what Ayanna Pressley is trying to do here in Massachusetts as she seeks to unseat Mike Capuano, who is thought of as a pretty consistently progressive legislator in his own right. Is it fair to say that Ayanna Pressley is making the sort of pitch that Tanisha just described there?
Absolutely. She's trying to cast the vision from my perspective, and this is my personal perspective, not the position of the ACLU, but casting a vision of an inclusive society where there is representation in the halls of government that bring to bear the issues, the real life experiences of people of color, of poor people, of women. And so I think that's something that people can gravitate towards because they feel like when and where I enter into this conversation, I am represented within the halls of the legislature or city hall, even in local elections.
And I would think that that would be especially appealing if we're in a moment, as we seem to be right now, where you think that the president is making things worse when it comes to race relations. And here's a woman of color. Here's a chance to put her in Congress.
Right. It's a broad vision that people can find their place within. And I think one of the struggles I have is when we give that short shrift and dismiss it as identity politics. There's several problems with that nomenclature and the use of that term. One, it's as if white people don't have an identity, and that when people talk about their experience as a woman or talk about their experience as someone who is black or who is Latinx, that is somehow different, that there aren't some consistent experiences across racial lines around socioeconomics, right? This whole condemning of the Democratic Party to abandon the white working class as if poor black and brown folks don't have those same concerns.
Right, right. Let me ask you actually about the Democrats and a move that they just made recently. They, and tell me if I get this right, I'm always a little rocky when it comes to party rules and, insider protocol, but my understanding is that the Democrats basically said, all right, we're going to keep superdelegates, the people who automatically get to go to the convention, but we're not going to get them. We're not going to let them vote the first time around. They'll get to vote in the second round if the party hasn't settled on a nominee. This was done in response to the protests of the Bernie Sanders contingent and elicited a lot of frustration on the part of the Congressional Black Caucus and others. The CBC, I think, has a lot of superdelegates in its midst. They thought that this was basically disenfranchisement. Is the Democratic Party, whether it's with this or other stuff, do they still have institutional baggage that they need to work through when it comes to race?
Look, I think both parties and no party has institutional baggage when it comes to structural and institutionalized racism. Look, none of these systems were created with people who look like me in mind, black folks, brown folks, women. And so what I appreciate most about this moment in time is that it's causing not only the Democratic Party as a whole, but I think across this nation, I think it's causing us to be reflective about the values that we're espousing and really challenging ourselves as to whether or not our actions are aligned with those values.
What is your take on the superdelegate shift that the party made and, the implications of maybe taking away an avenue for people of color to make their influence felt inside the Democratic Party?
I think it always raises a larger question about where is our power and how influential is it? I think, the point that Tanisha raises around structural and institutional racism within parties, within governmental structures, is always something that needs to be interrogated. I think what we saw at the last presidential election raised significant concerns, and I think it's important that there was some level of a response to it, but what the ultimate outcome of that is yet to be seen.
Final question for you guys, and I need brief answers if you can give them. The Voting Rights Act had a key provision that was struck down by the Supreme Court back in, I think, 2013, saying that certain states had to check with the federal government before they changed voting laws.
Right.
Are there any states we should be keeping an eye on heading into the midterms where mechanisms are being implemented that might suppress the turnout among African Americans or other voters?
All of them.
Oh,
Thank you.
okay, there you go.
Thank you.
Are we living in America? No. I mean, I think there are 22 states in particular that are of concern that have been going through voter purges, removing people, where they're closing polling locations, where they're implementing ID laws. It's mostly states in the South, Texas, Georgia, North Carolina, but it's something that we need to be vigilant about throughout the country.
All right,
Absolutely on that point. I think that we cannot start to pinpoint different parts of the country or different states where there's a problem, because then we might get a little bit lax when it comes to other parts of the country. Look, whether voter suppression supplants the power of the people, and so we always have to remain vigilant in making sure that voting access and rights is shored up.
Tanisha Sullivan, Rahsaan Hall, thank you both for being here.
Thank you.